Hi, I'm Marcel, and welcome to me screaming into the void, mostly about books. I've been doing 2 readathons this month. One is Women in Translation Month because it's August and therefore Women in Translation Month. And the other is PickPongathon, and it's hosted by Bond Book Reviews by Crystal. Now, being on Team Ping Pong Pros, I can't say what prompts we are doing because there is a somewhat thing I think is going to happen where we are going to guess each other's prompts. I do not know yet. So I am talking only about the books and the way they fit the Women in Translation Month prompts. And the first book I read was for the prompt The High Priestess. And The High Priestess is a book that's about magical realism, and it's Eva Luna by Isabel Allende. And I fell absolutely in love with this book. Eva Luna is a young girl born to a maid in Chile, and the book is simply about her growing up and how she is able to both survive but also in a way thrive in a society that isn't necessarily the kindest, especially towards poor people. There is a lot of mention of domestic violence, of abuse, of war. A lot of terrible things are happening in Chile at the time, but what I enjoyed so much about the book is the characterization, not just with Eva Luna, but with all of the characters that she interacts with, and they are so clearly three-dimensional characters that live a life outside of the context of the book. And a lot of the book does reflect and talk about how we are bound by the interactions and bound by each other and can only thrive by being in each other's company. For Curb Appeal, which is a book you chose based solely on the cover, I picked Eva Luna Tells, or Eva Luna Stories. I've seen both translations, and this is in some way a follow-up to Eva Luna. So one of the things in Eva Luna, one of the ways she bonds with people, is that she tells stories, and that is the way the book also highlights the importance of art for people who don't necessarily have a lot of means. That art, it gives warmth, that art gives hope. Art is a way of talking about what is going on. So this is sadly not as good as Eva Luna. The stories are fine. It's a short story collection, and they're absolutely, some of them are absolutely brilliant in and of themselves. But other than the sort of framework of it starting and ending with Eva Luna being asked to tell these stories, I don't really understand what this book has to do with Eva Luna. It seems almost like the Eva Luna framework is more of a gimmick than it actually has anything to do with either the stories or the way you should understand the original Eva Luna story. Then I've read for the Victorian prompt. The Victorian prompt is a prize-winning novel, and I've read a book that's won a translated prize. So this won a prize for their English translation. And it's by the Ukrainian Oksana Zabusko, and it's called The Museum of the Abandoned Secrets. So the book is about a family saga and how the family deals with the Soviet Union when Ukraine was a part of the Soviet Union, and especially what happened in Ukraine when Ukraine became its independent country again. So it's a lot about how do you as a society deal and heal from the things that were happening in Ukraine during the Soviet Union. This book became very popular after the invasion of Ukraine. Surprise, surprise. And I enjoyed the fact that the book didn't present an easy solution. It didn't present this is the right way of doing it. It very honestly depicted tough decisions and tough questions in a very honest and non-judgmental way. And one of the things I really enjoyed about the book is that the book didn't present anything as an easy answer. It didn't say this is the right way to deal, this is the right way to heal. It simply presented a lot of complicated issues as the complicated issues that they were. For the prompt, the Continental, which is a prompt of a book by an author of a different continent to you, I read Concerning My Daughter by Kim Hyo-jin, which is a South Korean author. And this book is about a mother who has lost contact with her daughter up until the daughter takes contact with her to ask if she and her lesbian partner can live with the mother for some time because they are having housing problems, and how the mother deals with having her estranged daughter and her lesbian partner back into her life. In addition, the mother works as a carer at an old folks home, and the woman she cares for is an old woman who isn't married and doesn't have her own children. That's why she ended up at the old folks home. And interesting with the book, despite the book not saying that the mother being homophobic isn't a correct solution, it doesn't really talk about the mother's homophobia as something purely retaining to the mother. The book is clearly trying to dissect the mother's thoughts and feelings in the larger context of South Korea, where it is taboo to be queer. And so she talks about in the book the difficulty, for example, it is on elderly parents who do not have children, and indirectly then talking also about, for example, queer couples who will not have biological children of their own. How do you sort of solve that solution and the fear that that brings out in someone? So it is in a way sort of talking about or using the relationship between the mother to daughter, but more than that, the mother and the lesbian partner, as a way of talking about the large affairs of society in South Korea without saying that the affairs are right. That was a weird way of phrasing it. But the book is very clearly stating it is okay to be a lesbian, and the author is very clearly stating it's okay to be lesbian. But it's more about how a lot of the arguments against lesbianism, and probably all other queerness, but the book talks about lesbian, in the sort of talking about how, but this is a result of how our world is organized, how our country is organized, and that is what is influencing this. So if we hadn't been organized the same way, then this wouldn't really be an issue. So I enjoyed how using these characters, Kim Hye-jin was able to lift up the story to be about more than just these three people. For the prompt, The Debutante, which is a debut book, I read Disoriental by Nagar Diawadi. She is a French Iranian author. She fled from Iran as a very small child with her family because of her family's connections, and moved to France. So she was raised in France. And the book is a story about a family going through the same things that she did as a child, talking about it mostly from what would have been her mother's point of view. And there is probably a lot of autobiographical elements in the book, so much that I actually had to check certain things to see, is this actually just a memoir or is this a fiction book? So it is a fiction book, but it sort of straddles between being a fiction book and a memoir. And she talks about it, as I stated, mostly from her mother's point of view, or what would have been her mother's point of view, but she also talks about it from her own point of view. And again, a lot of the focus of the book is the family interaction, about how different family members have different expectations, different things they need to do, things they are able to do and not able to do, and also things that she is able to do, kind of. She is queer. It turns out that she is queer. The one with the characters is queer. And she, as in the main character of the book, or one of the main characters of the book, that probably is the one that resembles the author, for example, also talks about either an uncle or a granduncle. That also, I think, happens to be a homosexual, but where that was talked about very differently, in the sense that it was accepted yet not accepted. It was a very interesting, the way she talked about how that was sort of acted out as something that was invisible, but clearly something everyone knew, in comparison to her own queer journey. So she talks a lot about power dynamics, a lot about being a migrant. That's, for example, one of the things with Disoriental, being Iranian and therefore being from the Orient, and how she has to sort of remove that part of her identity to be able to be fully immigrated to society in France and become French in a way. And because the main character, or one of the main characters, so you have the mother and you have the daughter. So the daughter is also the youngest of them. So she is also the one who has least memories from Iran, and also statistically the youngest are the ones who are most similar to whatever culture a family emigrates to. So in that sense, she is a very typical immigration story and a typical refugee story. For genre hopper, that is a book from a genre you don't usually read. I've read the poetry collection by Ophelia Cepeda. She is an indigenous person from the US. I think, if I understood correctly, her tribe was from the south in the US, because she talks a lot about water, and she originally wrote these poems in her native language and then translated it herself into English. Water, as I said, is a theme in a lot of her poems, and the reason why I think she is, or her tribe is, from south in the US and sort of the desert area, is that despite it being ocean power, that the title is Ocean Power, my impression of the poems is that she talked more about rain. She talked more about the importance of having drinking water, which is rainwater, and not so much about ocean and sea. It might be that there's something here I'm not really understanding, but I got more focus on rain from her poems. Then I read for the prompt The Shorty, which is a short story collection. I read White Snake and Other Tales by Gailing Yen. She is a Chinese author. And the White Snake is a very famous Chinese myth about a man who realizes that he is married to a white snake demon. And what Gailing Yen does is translate that myth into a lesbian context. So she is retelling the story, modernizing it, turning the white snake demon into a dancer, by a very famous ballet dancer who is able to contort her body. And talking about this woman getting a lesbian partner. And the story is very, very familiar as the White Snake myth. So you see that, she's not just taking a name on something, she is actually translating the story and giving it into a new context. And that is very clear for a lot of the other stories of this book as well. A lot of them does have a lesbian undertone or just a lesbian plot retelling. And what she does with the whole lesbian thing is as if you need a whole lesbian thing. But the stories, by giving it these lesbian plots, move the focus to talk about being a minority within a Chinese setting and a Chinese culture, and pointing out how difficult that can be for a lot of minorities in China. In addition, she also, of uses the lesbianism, and this is a very typical way of using it, as a way of talking about women's position in China, considering that China is a very patriarchal society. There is still a very old-fashioned way of, this is your gender roles and this is your gender roles in the way the society is organized. And by turning the characters lesbian, you are able to both highlight these aspects but also turn them a bit on the head. For example, in one of the stories, it's about a lesbian woman who marries a man but keeps a female lover on the side. And she is able to do that because nobody thinks that women can be attracted to other women. So that's a way you sort of turn a lot of these things on the side, on their heads. For the prompt, The Jet Setter, which is a book by an author from a country I've never visited, I read The Housekeeper and the Professor by Yuki Ogawa, who is a Japanese author. And I cried basically from start to end of this book. It's such a sweet book. It's about the housekeeper who gets a new job at the professor. The professor is a maths professor. And the maths professor has a brain injury, which means that he can only remember things in 80-minute chunks. And the book is simply about how the housekeeper and the professor and the housekeeper's son, Root, Root isn't his real name, it's a name that the professor gave him because he has a flat head like the root sign. How they are able to create a form of companionship despite the fact that the professor only remembers things in 80-minute chunks. Of course, one of the things that you are very quickly thinking about when reading the book about an older person who does not have any more long-term memory is the elderly with Alzheimer's or dementia, and about how you can still create bond with people who only live, who's only living in the moment and aren't going to remember anything about that. So that's probably one of the reasons why I was bawling, because it's such a heartwarming story. And it's heartwarming also in the sense that even when certain people are doing the things that they're not supposed to do, you still have an understanding for why they are doing it. There is no really villain in the story. It's a purely character-driven story about how these three people are able to interact and create a thriving friendship despite everything that is going on. For the playlist page, I read Solinka, and in Norwegian the book is titled Solinka Opens Her Eyes, but I also seen the English translation being just Solinka, and it's by the Russian author Guzel Jakina. And this is a book about a woman who is Tatar, and that's a Russian minority from sort of going way back from the Orient that moved into the Asian part of Russia, South Asian part of Russia, and how they during the 1930s up until the end of the Second World War were hounded by the Soviet government for being a minority, and being a minority not being role models, being something we should be fair for, and you don't really know what else is said about this group. But these groups have sort of been moved around, and Zulenka is one of those who are then transported from her town up into the Siberian for 15 years, trying to just survive in these internment camps. The book clearly, based on what I read about the book, struck a nerve when it was first published. But what I really enjoyed about it, and why I sort of enjoyed the Norwegian title, which is Zelenka Opens Her Eyes, is that there is something about this young woman who had such a rough life at the beginning of the book. It starts with her living with her husband and abusive mother-in-law, is barely surviving, and by being put in an absolutely horrible situation, is able to find her own strength, is able to be open to what am I actually capable of, what am I actually able to do. So despite the story sort of being very bleak, it is a very empowering story. Despite that, or maybe because of that, you can also make the argument that Zelenka is able to open her eyes because she is put in all of those horrible situations she is put in. So yeah. And the last book, the last prompt I've read for Women in Translation, I went for The Time Machine, which is a classic novel written in a different era. And I went for The Case of the Lamp That Went Out, which is a Joe Miller detective story written by Austrian August Gruner. I've read some of her Detective Miller work beforehand, and they are very classical detective stories, which are fun to sort of read if you're tired and don't really want to have to focus so much. The thing about Joe Miller is that he was accused of a crime. So that is sort of his gimmick, that he is an ex-con detective. And what that does with the story is, of course, that it is a very empathetic story. He has a lot of sympathy for the people doing these crimes. Other than that, it's also very sort of, it's okay. The way Agatha Christie can be okay, Sherlock Holmes can be okay. You either enjoy the genre of detective or you don't. So I think that a lot of Joe Miller it's a fun genre. Joe Miller is sort of fun to just have in that whole detective rotation, just so you sort of don't get too tired of one detective trope. Comments down below, and thank you for listening to me screaming into the void.